Sponsored program are strictly those of the host, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of this station, its staff, management, or sponsors.
Welcome to the Timeshare Information Network, where we cover all things timeshare. Whether you've owned a timeshare for years, just purchased one, or are thinking about becoming an owner, this program is for you. Now here's your moderator and co-host, Lisa Ann Schreier, the Timeshare Crusader.
Hello and welcome to the Timeshare Information Network. We're here to discuss all things timeshare in an informal, convenient format. Right from the start, let's get this out there. We're not here to sell you a timeshare. Actually, we're not here to sell you anything. We're here to provide you with all the information you need at every stage of purchasing, using, and exiting your timeshare. I'm your co-host and moderator, Lisa Ann Schreier, the Timeshare Crusader. I've been in and around the industry for 20 years. My mission is simple. I'm here to educate consumers and serve as a catalyst for positive change in the timeshare industry. My co-host is Andrew Meyer, Managing Partner at the Finn Law Group in St. Petersburg, Florida. Welcome, Andy.
Hey, Lisa. Glad to be on the show with you again.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be bringing this information to consumers along with you. Each program, we're going to be talking about some current events that impact timeshare owners, as well as doing our best to explain timeshare issues. As you'll discover, things aren't necessarily as simple and easy as a timeshare salesperson or one of those self-proclaimed exit specialists make it sound. If you have questions, concerns, or an idea for a future program, we want to hear from you. You can email me at lisa@theti.net. That's lisa@theti.net. So settle in and let's get ready to learn something. Andy, I think it would be ideal to start our program today with a brief evolution of the timeshare product. I think we all know how it began, but it really has gone through an enormous number of changes, and some of those changes have major impacts on owners. Can you tell us about this long journey of the timeshare product?
Sure, Lisa. So it's interesting. I think that timeshare, when most people hear that term, they think about what we would call a legacy or a traditional timeshare product, and that is a specific unit and week at a resort somewhere. I think when timeshare first started, that's how people like to travel. They like to go to the same place each year, see the same people, know that they had a place to land, at a certain time of year, bring the family down. Maybe you stayed at the beach. Maybe you wanted to stay in the Orlando area. But as time has gone on, people's travel habits have changed tremendously. And it isn't like that anymore. People don't typically want to go necessarily to the same exact unit and week, the same place every time. So the timeshare industry has evolved as people's travel preferences have changed over time as well. And so traditionally, when you would have bought a timeshare that would have only been for a specific unit and week, now timeshare developers tend to focus on flexibility and points usually, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in today's show. But I think, it's no longer a situation where you own just, one unit and one slice of that unit. It typically is a more complicated product nowadays. Also, in the expenses and the pricing of timeshare has gone up over time. I don't think that it's quite as simple as it was when timeshare was first thought of and began. So that's another thing that I think we need to talk to consumers about is the complicated nature of the timeshare product in today's world.
Andy, let me interject here for a moment, if you don't mind. When you were talking about earlier a fixed week, a fixed unit, and a fixed place, have the exchange companies, notably RCI and II, Interval International, have they been around from the beginning of the timeshare industry. And for those listeners who aren't completely aware, an exchange company, correct me if I'm wrong, Andy, but is an independent company that allows the owner to exchange or trade their unit for another unit in either the same resort or another resort. Have those two companies been around for a long time?
Well, they have been around for a long time. I don't know that they were at the initial iteration of the timeshare product. I think they came later. But, even in the 90s, there was a lot of timeshare exchange programs that were developed. Again, as people began to want to go to different places, the industry had to grapple with this problem. How do we allow people to have flexibility, but still have, a specific timeshare unit that they're obligated to, pay for maintenance fees and whatnot? So how can we kind of run both sides of that? And so at first, I think there was, this notion of exchange programs, and they've now, as you say, Lisa, you have independent companies that you can join. It's at least now it's typically a part of the initial transaction, and so you get brought into these programs at the time you're buying. But now I think that the main emphasis of the timeshare developer has morphed to the timeshare points and less putting your unit a week into an exchange program, although that still does happen and is, of course, a big part of how people use their timeshare today, even still.
Andy, would you say that in terms of ease of use, would you say that a fixed week is easier to use and understand, but gives you less flexibility than points, and obviously vice versa, that a point-based timeshare would be harder or more difficult to manage, but gives the owner more flexibility in terms of using it?
Right, I agree, yes. And also I think it's important, Lisa, to distinguish between smaller resorts that are often independently operated and larger timeshare developers that are branded, because you typically, at least now, would see fixed unit week type of arrangement with a more independent, what we would call legacy resort, maybe a small place out on the beach somewhere, maybe that was built in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, something like that. Whereas, the main branded timeshare developers now have, gigantic resorts, also to beaches, but a lot of them have them in Orlando or Branson or other popular destinations. And these are going to be, larger multi-unit developments, maybe more modern amenities, that type of thing. And those tend to be more complicated to use because if you're going with a larger developer, that's when you then start getting into the points situation, and you're no longer just having a specific unit and week. So I do think you're right as far as understanding what you own and how to use it. The old-timey smaller resort situation was certainly easier to wrap your mind around. Today's product is a little bit more complicated. And, of course, from the timeshare developer perspective, they would say that this additional complexity is designed to give you flexibility. And that's as good as far as it goes, but you have to make sure you understand what you're buying and what you're obligating yourself to do when you sign the timeshare contract.
Absolutely. It's a really good point. This is not something to be entered into lightly, and certainly not anything to be entered into for an average price of around $20,000 based on a 3-hour timeshare sales presentation. And I know we talked briefly about RCI and II, and just to let our listeners know, between RCI and Interval International, there are almost 6,000 resorts worldwide. But as Andy said, it's not quite as easy to transfer into some of those locations as the salesperson makes it out to be. Obviously, supply and demand come into it. Popularity comes into it. So it's important to understand that if you own a proverbial off-season week in Alabama, Fair to say, Andy, that you're not going to be trading that week into Christmas week on the Big Island of Hawaii. Am I correct?
That's right. Absolutely true. You know, I will say I do tend to tell people that the timeshare transaction, at least now in its modern version, is as complicated, if not more complicated, than a house purchase. Anybody who's been through the timeshare presentation in recent times will remember the number of documents that were given to them, that they were required to sign, the amount of information that was given to them in a very short period of time. And all of that goes into the complexity of using your product. And now that you've got these points, how do you use them and what's available to you? And this is something that, unfortunately, I see frequently as people, once they do finally try to use that product they purchased and understand it and understand how it works, they feel they didn't get what they thought they were buying. And that's when the problems arise. But really, at the front side of it, you have to go into the transaction with your eyes wide open and be prepared to embrace the complexity and understand what it is you're buying and what it is you're obligating yourself to do.
Correct. Yeah, definitely. And it's important to understand, I think we're going to be covering this in a future program. We're going to be covering a lot of the what happens during the closing or the verification process of buying a timeshare, and specifically what to look out for in the documents and the disclosures, including the public offering statement, because as you said, lately there's more paperwork and it's more complex buying a timeshare than it is buying a house, which is fairly mind-blowing when you consider how long and how much research people do when they're buying a house versus how little research and how little help they have when they're buying a timeshare, because nobody goes into buying a timeshare with an attorney or anybody on their side. It's them and the salesperson and the sales manager, often known as a closer. And then if they do decide to buy, verification officer. And at this point, the consumer has been there for maybe 3 hours. They don't want to spend another 3-4 hours going over every single line of the documentation, which of course gives the advantage to the developer, because nobody wants to be at a timeshare resort for 7 hours going over paperwork. Am I right?
That's right. And you mentioned this phrase, you said public offering statement. And of course, to you and I that we live in the timeshare world, we know exactly what that means. But to the average consumer, that's a foreign concept, I suspect. And the public offering statement is a typically very lengthy document that outlines many of the developers' responsibilities and obligations to the consumer, but also your rights and your obligations as well as a purchaser. It's a document that has been filed with the state, approved by the state, and is a matter of public record, but it's very lengthy, and it's an important and critical document that governs your rights and obligations when you're buying a timeshare.
Great. Yeah, we're definitely going to be covering that in a future show. It certainly explains why there's so much misinformation out there, and that's the reason we're doing this show, is to eliminate some of that misinformation. After this break, we're going to take a look at some terms that the industry uses that can have a drastic impact on consumers and how they use their timeshare. We'll be right back.
If a tree falls in the woods and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Have you ever felt that your voice goes unheard? And you think that you can make a difference if only someone would listen? It's time for women in business to have a place to step into your power, a platform to embrace your hopes, dreams, and your vision, a voice to heal and restore. Your voice can make a difference. We have a platform you deserve to share your story and let your voice be heard. Be kind to yourself. Give yourself the chance to be heard and shine bright. Contact New Dawn Media by texting CAFE to 55312. That's CAFE to 55312. or call us at 866-224-5422. Your voice can make a difference.
Welcome back to the Timeshare Information Network. As a reminder, the Timeshare Information Network airs live every other Monday at 6:30 p.m. in South Florida on 95.3, 96.9, 1470, and on WWNN Radio on the Beasley Network. Of course, you can listen in from anywhere by accessing those stations online. If you missed anything or want to listen again, we're also available as a podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Just look for the Timeshare Information Network. And now, back to your moderator and co-host, Lisa Ann Schreier.
Welcome back to the Timeshare Information Network. I'm Lisa Ann Schreier, the Timeshare Crusader, and with me is attorney and managing partner Andy Meyer of the Finn Law Group in Florida. Andy, earlier when you were enlightening us with the evolution of timeshare, you used some legal terms, because you are a lawyer, which some of our listeners might not be familiar with. Could we shed some light on some of those terms?
Absolutely. As we've been talking about, Lisa, the timeshare transaction is very complicated, legally speaking. It has a lot of pieces of the puzzle, and it isn't just as simple as it may seem when you've been at a timeshare presentation and spent the day listening and touring and come back away from that experience with a brand new timeshare. Lots going on in the background that you may not know about.
Absolutely. So let's start with a really basic question, if you don't mind. In the world of timeshare, what is a deed?
So I think people who own a home are certainly familiar with the idea of a deed. This is a conveyance of real estate. It means you own a home on land. And so that deed gets recorded in the public records so that anyone else can know that you are the true owner of that parcel of real estate and the house that's on it. And if you're an owner of a condominium, you know that you received a deed. And you now own a particular unit, and you have all the rights to go with that ownership that are outlined in that deed. The deed will describe what it is you own. Well, same thing for timeshare, at least in its most basic iteration. You're going to receive a deed, and it's going to tell you which unit and week, in theory, that you own. There will be a legal description in that document that purports to tell you what you purchased.
Akin, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you. It's basically akin to a legal description of the property as you get a deed to a house or a condo. Am I correct?
That's right. It is. And, of course, as we've been talking about, the complexities start to kick in here because to be something that can be recorded by deed, it has to be what is called a timeshare estate. And that term, timeshare estate, is defined by Florida law, and it gets kind of complicated as to what that can be. People will look at the deed, if they look at the deed, and they may not necessarily understand what they purchased. And that's just the beginning of the complications and the intricacies of the timeshare product. But yes, the theory is that the deed would tell you what you purchased.
Great. And I know you and I have been talking a little bit about points. In a nutshell, what's the difference between a timeshare week, which I assume is a deed, and timeshare points? Are points also covered by a legal deed, a legal description? So
yes, and then this is again where we have to be careful, because it would be very easy to go down the rabbit hole of legal theory and legal complications here. But points are not real estate, so you're not going to get points via a deed. A deed is designed to convey real estate. Points are an abstraction. They're something that you can't get a hold of, but what they're representing is kind of like currency or money in a sense. They're supposed to be something that you can use to make reservations, either with your developer or with an exchange program like you were talking about earlier, an RCI, for example. You can have points, and those are going to be given to you in the contractual documents that you've signed. There's not going to be a deed that will record that conveyance to you of points, but it will be in the documentation of your purchase. They'll tell you how many points you've been given. And of course, you mentioned earlier, Lisa, part of the problem there is, points for, say, your developer may be more or less valuable than the same number of points with RCI or another exchange program. They don't necessarily translate, and your point value can be diluted over time as your developer issues more of them. And they're not
right. And one of the other things is that you just touched on that, is that points are not the same in each system. So whereas a week at a resort may be 10,000 points, a week at another resort may be 200 points. There's no parity between the systems, which again leads to the complication we were talking about earlier. And I know, Andy, you can own a deed and you can own points, and then you can own that same deed or points, but it's held in a trust, and the trustee of the deed or the points is the developer. Am I correct? What exactly is a trust?
Well, that's right, Lisa. And again, another whole area that lawyers specialize in trust and estates, for example, because trusts themselves are a very complicated legal concept and construct. But essentially, an idea of a trust is that you hand over whatever it is you own to be put into the trust, and the trust is managed by someone else, trustee or trustees. And you are given then a beneficial interest in that trust. You're a trust owner, and the trustee owes duties to you, but you don't own your thing any longer. So you don't actually own the timeshare, you don't own your points, but you own an interest in the trust. And that, of course, creates a whole nother level and layer of complexity now, because what obligations the trustee has to you are governed by the trust document. And that itself could be very lengthy and complicated. And many a lawsuit has come from, breach of trust obligations by the trustee and vice versa. So it's an interesting way to own it. A lot of developers are going that way. Definitely, there's benefits for the developer in doing so. And there's also tax implications that flow from owning something in a trust. Some people may be familiar with a living trust as an example for something that you would have as an individual. But all those things can add
I
more
would
complexity.
certainly want you with me if I were to ever buy a timeshare, because there's no way I would remember all of these terms and exactly what the rights and responsibility of each party is. And I know that another term that the developer uses, or some developers, I should say, use, is called a right of first refusal. What exactly is a right of first refusal, and is it a good thing for consumers if developers have that in place? So
the first part of your question is, what is a right of first refusal? And so what that is the developer will retain the right to purchase your timeshare from you first before you can sell it to anyone else. So if the developer has retained that right and you want to try to sell your timeshare to someone else, you have to let the developer know, and the developer can exercise that right of first refusal and buy it back from you before you sell it to someone else. And that can be good, but typically it's not for the consumer. Typically that's not a favorable arrangement for the consumer. But of course there's always exceptions to that. But it really emphasizes a tricky point, Lisa, that consumers need to be aware of when they're thinking about a timeshare product, and that is, how do you sell it if you don't want it anymore? What are your obligations and what are your rights to sell? What do you own? What can you sell? These things aren't as simple as they sound, especially if there's a right of first refusal, for example. How is that going to impact your ability to resell it? Sometimes the contractual documents limit who you can sell it to. Sometimes it can only be family members. And other times, a little bit less commonly, but sometimes you do not have the right to sell all of the same things that you bought. So, for example, you may have access to certain amenities. You may not have the right to sell those to someone else. You may only be able to sell your timeshare estate, your timeshare interest. But all of that is governed on the documents that you're signing at that,
2 minutes.
at that closing that you're doing.
Wow. Well, thank you. I definitely learned something, and I'm sure our listeners did as well. We have about 2 or 3 minutes left, and I want to talk briefly. There's been a lot of news stories surrounding one of the self-proclaimed companies that claim to be able to get you out of your timeshare, and they suddenly close their offices. They're not answering the phone, which leaves a lot of frustrated owners out thousands of dollars. Can you talk a little bit in our remaining 2 minutes about the dangers of engaging with one of these companies, as well as give us some tips on what consumers can do if, in fact, they've been a victim of one of these companies?
Yes, I'd say to a consumer, please do your due diligence. If you're
1 minute.
trying to get out of your timeshare for whatever reason, be very careful. Do your research. As Lisa's saying, that you'll find available on the internet information about timeshare exit companies that have closed their doors and left consumers high and dry. So be sure you're very careful. As we've been talking about tonight, it's a very complicated product you've purchased, a lot of legal obligations, and you really want to be putting yourself in the hands of someone who can understand that.
Great. We're going to be discussing this in detail in an upcoming episode. That's it for this episode of the Timeshare Information Network. For Andy Meyer and myself, Lisa Ann Schreier, thanks for joining us. And remember to avoid anyone who uses the words free, perfect, always, and never.
You've been listening to the Timeshare Information Network. The Timeshare Information Network airs live every other Monday at 6:30 p.m. in South Florida on 95.3, 96.9, 1470, and on WWNN Radio on the Beasley Network. We're also available as a podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Just look for the Timeshare Information Network. We'll see you next time on the Timeshare